sure you all know Cormac very well. He's master of ceremonies here and looks after all the winter talks and does a great job of them. And thank you, Cormac. So I think without any further ado, I'll hand you over to the man himself.
Thank you, Negi, and good evening, Agreed Ursula, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming out on this cold night. Now, I first put this talk together for an underwater archaeological group that I was a member of many years ago. We were all mad into diving on shipwrecks back then. I see a few old faces from that group here in the audience tonight. But during the reign of the Emperor Caligula, there were two gigantic ships built for the Emperor to float on this little lake here. And they were taken up out of the lake in the 1920s and the 1930s. Now, I'll just go back a little bit there. Just tell you first of all about Lake Nemi. Lake Nemi is about 35 kilometres southeast of Rome, and there's several little lakes there. It's about at the same level as the Dublin Mountains, and the lake bears a remarkable similarity to Loch Bray, to Lower Loch Bray. You do the lights, please. Thank you. Yeah, very, very similar. It's not a very big lake. It's about 1.5 kilometres long and about 1 kilometre wide. Beautiful place though. That's it there. It's a very, very magical sort of place. Look, beautiful ambience there, and it hasn't changed much since the time of Caligula. Very, very unspoiled. It's a place of a lot of virtual wilderness, wild strawberries and beautiful woods and so forth. It's actually the caldera, it remains of an extinct volcano. There's another lake up above it, similar to the one that you have in the Dublin Mountains, the upper and lower Loch Bray. Very similar indeed. But these were ginormous ships, absolutely enormous ships. One of them was 67 metres long, 68 metres, and the other was 71 metres long. 67 metres by 19 metres, 71 metres by 24 metres. They were designated during the 1920s and 30s as the prima nave and seconda nave. That was the first and second ship. Now, it's generally believed that they were built by the Emperor, or for the Emperor Caligula, one as a floating palace and the other one as a temple to some of the great many deities that are associated with this particular lake and that part of Italy. They were capable of being rowed around the lake, not that they would have gone very far. And they had these side platforms here that were covered in where the people on board the ship couldn't see the rowers. The rowers were more than likely slaves. And there's some great big beams on the ships when they were taken up that held these side platforms, and I'll be showing you some of those and the things associated with them as we go along. But if you put the two ships together, they would take up virtually the area of a football pitch. And that's one of them there. That was the first one that was taken up. Now, it was an enormous achievement because nothing comparable to it had been done before, and nothing comparable to it was done for a great many years afterwards. When this ship here was taken up out of the mud of Stockholm Harbour, the Vasa, which was built for King Gustavus Adolphus Vasa. It sank on its maiden voyage, heeled over in much the same way as the Mary Rose, and the water came in through the gun ports and it sank down into the mud of Stockholm Harbour. On its maiden voyage, it had only ever travelled 1.5 kilometres in total, in its total life. But that was taken up and conserved. Equally with the Mary Rose was taken up out of the mud of Portsmouth, and that was done in the 1980s. A lot of you may remember it. It was a great episode on television about it, and both of them were conserved by the same method, a method that wasn't around at the time of the Lake Nemi ships. They were conserved using a material called polyethylene glycol, and the two ships, the Vasa and the Mary Rose, were sprayed with polyethylene glycol for about 10 years. Now, polyethylene glycol is a sort of soluble wax, and that had the effect of displacing all the water out of the timber. And when they finally switched off the spray, the wax solidified, and they just ran a hairdryer, a thing like a hairdryer over it, smoothed it off. And they're both very well preserved today, wonderful exhibits. But that method of conservation wasn't around at the time of the raising of the Lake Nemi ships. They used a different method. That's the museum. Both of these other ships have beautiful museums built up around them. That's the one in Stockholm for the Vasa, and that's the new museum that houses the Mary Rose. In addition to the ships, just like the Lake Nemi ships, there were thousands of artefacts found in both of the ships, which give you a great insight into what life was like in all of those periods. Now, I first found out about these ships when I was a child, because my late father Fred had two things, in addition to a great many other things, in common with myself. He was a marine buff. He was interested in all things maritime, ships and boats and the sea, and he had a very strong dose of advanced magpieism. He collected things, just as I'm prone to do myself, and he had quite a large library. And in his library, he had a set of postcards that were got up at the time of the raising of the ships, back in the late 1920s and early 30s. And I should have actually brought them down tonight. I think there's 6 or 7 in it altogether. They were published as a set. And I was fascinated when I was a child about that. My father explained to me what they were, and I've been fascinated by it ever since. So it gave me every excuse to look into things. Now, the Emperor Caligula was a strange person. He only reigned for 4 years, from 37 AD to just near the end of 41 AD, a little less than 4 years. He was the great-grandson of the Emperor Augustus, and he was the man who succeeded Augustus. He was his grandnephew. But being a successor to a Roman emperor back in the day was a thing that was fraught with a lot of danger, because it wasn't always the eldest son that inherited the title throughout the whole of the Roman period. Primogeniture, that's known as, which existed in other royalty outfits. It was more akin to the sort of system that we had in Ireland in the pre-invasion days. It was known as tanistry, that the incumbent would nominate his successor, and that in turn gave rise to a whole lot of internecine murders, and poisoning was a great way of getting rid of people back in this particular time, and a great many would-be emperors were to perish in that sort of way. But he was definitely rather psychotic, I imagine. He did all kinds of very strange things. He elected his horse to the Senate, first of all, and he actually invaded Britain. He got an army, a huge army together, and a huge fleet of ships being built in Gaul to invade Britain. This was after Julius Caesar had been there, and before the man who came after him successfully invaded Britain, Claudius. He invaded Britain. The ships landed on the south of England, and he got all the soldiers and the legions to pick up shells off the beach and load them into the ships, and he sailed back to Gaul, and that was the end of his invasion. Very strange man indeed, but a very ordinary looking person really. This is a marble bust of him, and you can never tell that he had all kinds of strange proclivities by looking at him there. As I say, he's very ordinary looking. In fact, he looks the spitting image of my son's brother-in-law, Mick the plumber. Very ordinary looking guy. Mick White. Now, Lake Nemi, there's a couple of slides here a little bit out of sequence. Lake Nemi is very, very closely associated with several deities, Roman deities, but in particular the goddess Diana, who had been borrowed from the Greek mythology. There are several temples to Diana, and statues have been found and so forth around the edge of the lake. And it's generally reckoned that one of the ships was a temple to Diana. She's always depicted as a huntress. She was the goddess of wildlife and the wilderness and various other things also. And she's nearly always depicted as a huntress with a bow and arrow and some form of wildlife or other with her. Lake Nemi is also associated with the people who are supposed to be the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. They're reputed to have been born around the shore of Loch Nemi somewhere. And the image of the wolf, they were raised by a she-wolf, having been abandoned in the wild. And the image of the wolf has an awful lot to do with the ships, as we'll see. But it was a place during the before and after the Napoleonic Wars. The Grand Tour was the great thing for people that had a lot of money. Wealthy people went on a tour, younger people generally, of Italy and places in France to soak up the culture and the art and to buy antiquities and art and stuff like that. And this was sort of on that particular itinerary for a lot of people. And a lot of artists painted images of Lake Nemi. In ancient times it was known as the Speculum Dianae, which means the mirror of Diana. Lord Byron wrote a poem about Nemi, having been there, and it starts out, Nemi naveled in the woody hills. Nice expression, that. It was also painted by J.M.W. Turner. That's just a watercolour. But I think the nicest image of all was painted by Joseph Wright of Derby, a wonderful artist. And I think that gives you a good idea of the kind of magical ambience of the lake. It's always been associated with mysticism and the veneration of various deities and what have you. And it was said that Augustus and Julius Caesar both had summer palaces up here. When it got very hot in Rome, it would have been a little more cooler up in the Alban Hills. It had about the same elevation as the Hellfire Club in the Dublin Mountains, around the same as that. But Caligula, as I say, he did all kinds of very strange things, including managing to spend practically all the money in the treasury that his predecessor had accumulated. Tiberius was his granduncle, and he was rather prudent and a bit of a tightwad about spending money, and there was a lot of money in the treasury which Caligula managed to spend in a matter of a year or two. But he also instituted a lot of games in the Colosseum, in the arena, and he was assassinated by members of his personal bodyguard. Now these were called the Praetorian Guard. Now the Praetorian Guard were just the emperor's bodyguard, and they were drawn from the legions, but they were the elite. You had to be a very elite soldier to get into it. And after that, they had no connection with the army whatsoever. They were answerable only to the emperor. And he made the mistake of purging the leadership of the Praetorian Guard a couple of times. And the rest of the lads decided it was time for him to go, for fear that they might be next. So on the way back from the games one day, they turned on him and stabbed him to death, and promptly elected his uncle, Claudius, to the post. Now Claudius was a different kettle of fish altogether. He was a very learned man, a very capable man, and a competent man, and he proved to be a very, very good emperor, in the Roman sense, at any rate, that is. You might all have seen that wonderful series on television, I, Claudius, with a wonderful actor took the part of Claudius in that. I can't remember his name now. But that's just a bit of bas-relief statuary of the Praetorian Guard. A lot of despots and emperors and dictators modelled their personal bodyguards on the Praetorian Guard of old, up to fairly modern times. Hitler had the SS, and they functioned in exactly the same way. They were drawn from the army, but thereafter, when they joined the SS, they had no more connection with the army as such. They were answerable only to Hitler. Benito Mussolini had the same. Now, Benito Mussolini figures quite strongly in this talk, in this story. We'll be seeing more of him later on, but he had a group called the Moschettieri. They were his own personal bodyguard. Functioned in much the same way as the Praetorian Guard. General Franco had another outfit like that. A lot of them did that it was a good move because it meant that you couldn't be deposed by the army as such. You had the Praetorian Guard who were loyal to yourself only. Now, the amazing thing about this whole story, it's a very interesting story, and it's also a very tragic story, as we'll see later on. But the most amazing thing about the whole story is that the fact, for the 2,000 years that the ships lay on the bottom of the lake, it was always known that they were there. The knowledge that they were there had never been lost. And over the centuries, various attempts were made to raise them, or attempts were made to bring stuff up off them, and some successful, others weren't. But the first serious attempt at raising the vessels was carried out in the 1400s by this man here, who was the Lord of Nemi. He owned a lot of the land around Lake Nemi, Cardinal Prospero Colonna. He was a very learned man, a historian and a great scholar, and he had gone into the history of the Roman ships there. And he hired a man called Leon Battista Alberti, who was a great an engineer, a great polymath, an artist also, very much in the style of Leonardo da Vinci, to try to see could he get the ships raised. Now, he hired divers who swam down to the ships to inspect them, and then he built a great big raft made of barrels and planks and everything else with a load of winches on them, and he hired divers to go down and attach grappling hooks and ropes and so forth, and they heaved and hauled with all their might, and nothing happened except that they tore lumps off the various parts of the ships. They were too deeply embedded in the mud. But a lot of scholars at the time came from far and wide in the mid-1400s to examine the wood that had been brought up, at any rate. Now, about 100 years later, a man called Francesco Di Marchi, who was a military engineer, decided he'd have a go at raising the ships. And to that end, he used a diving helmet, a very, very rudimentary diving helmet that had been invented by a man called De La Rena in 1535. Now, it was just a very simple wooden box affair made watertight that had a glass panel in it, and it was weighted down to sit on the man's shoulders. And he wrote a fairly long dissertation on his activities, measuring the ships and describing what was there. It subsequently turned out that his measurements were wildly inaccurate. But he also described as taking off his trousers while he was diving and having small fish nibbling his extremities. Great euphemism, that. At any rate, not very much came of that. In 1827, a man called, his name is Anesio Fosconi, decided he'd have a go, and he built a great big raft similar to the one that the previous guy had built, but except that he used a diving bell in the middle of it, and there were a whole lot of winches attached to it. It was made from hundreds of barrels. He was unsuccessful in the first year, and the very same thing happened. They simply just pulled bits off the ships, and the following year he came back to have another go, and all the barrels had disappeared because there was a bumper crop of grapes that year and a bumper amount of wine, and all the locals had robbed the barrels, so he had to give it up. But he used a diving bell, so he was able to see a little bit more perhaps than others would have done. Now, diving bells were in common use like from the Renaissance time forward, really. Now, they're basically just, a simple description of them is a bucket-shaped inverted object that traps air in it, and that you're able to breathe in a portion of it. Some of them you were able to induce more air down, increase the pressure to lower the level of the water in the bell. This one was invented by the astronomer Edmund Halley. You can see one today up on the quay wall in Sir John Rogerson's quay. It was used in the building of Alexandra Basin in Dublin Port and the North Wall extension, and was used up into the 1960s on the subsequent extensions to the port in the deep water berths. It's now a small museum, you might call it, a museum piece. It was saved from demolition and from being scrapped, and thankfully restored and put up there on the quay wall. But diving bells came in all shapes and sizes. This was a small personal bell used by a German called Kessler. And we often wonder, he used the small bell. There would have been a hook on top of that, and he would have been attached to the boat up above by a rope, hauling up. But we often wondered, he used it for recovering brass cannon and stuff like that from sunken ships. But we often wondered whether this was a weight or whether the occupant of the bell had suffered some severe physiological trauma by virtue of the pressure, and that he'd left his struts outside the bell. But there are several illustrations of that. It's not just a notional thing, it was an actual real diving bell. Nothing very much more happened until 1895, when a man called Eliseo Borgi took matters in hand, and he was an antique dealer, and he decided to have a go at the ship, but he approached it entirely differently. He got his hands on several sets of hard hat diving gear. Now this is generally known as standard dress diving: copper helmet, rubberized canvas suit, lead shoes, and weights around your neck and back, so forth. Now that was a very, very successful type of diving that was done for salvage and building underwater, and in actual fact that type of diving existed right up into the middle of the 20th century, because I saw it in use in several places around the world. In Dublin Port, I saw it in use in London, and the last place I saw it was in a place called Chittagong, which is now it was East Pakistan back then, it's now in Bangladesh. So it was used successfully all over the world. It was but perfected by a firm called C.B. Gorman Limited. Seaby was a German, and Gorman was an Irish sea captain. His name originally was O'Gorman, and he changed it to Gorman. And they were in the same firm was in existence until recently. I think there's still an offshoot of it in some aspect of the medical profession, still in existence. But he was very successful in that, and he was able to enter the wrecks himself and a couple of his colleagues there. The air was pumped down to them by a hand pump, which is just turned by hand. You always have to have a guy turning away. That's a picture of a standard dress now. Of course, it's been superseded now by various other types of equipment, and these are great collector's items now. You pay a right few bob now for a full diving outfit like that. I'm a member of the Historical Diving Society, which is based in Britain, and a lot of guys collect this gear and actually use it. They have rallies places and use the gear. Fascinating. Now, I've never gotten to use it myself.
A bit like the old gaffers.
Yeah, something similar. But Borgi was an antique dealer and a bit of an entrepreneur. So the first thing he did was he sold a lot of stuff that he brought up off the wrecks. But he also decided the best thing to do was to start a museum where he could charge money for people to come in and look at the artefacts. So he kept a lot of them there. And it was getting a bit out of hand. He was bringing up so much stuff that the Minister for Education in 1905 decided that it was time to put an end to this, that these were very, very rare artefacts and that they deserved to be conserved and exhibited in a proper way. So he put a ban on all further diving on the wrecks of Lake Nemi, and he bought all of the stuff that the guy had and that Borgi had, and got it put into the National Museum of Italy. Now, he also decided that there might be a possibility with the government involved that the wrecks could be taken out of the lake. So from 1905 onwards they were surveyed. This was one of the, I'll just go back one there. That artefact there disappeared during the transfer of artefacts from one museum to another later on in the story, and it only surfaced recently and it was recovered. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later on. It's actually a large piece of mosaic set in concrete. Now, the Romans were dab hands at using concrete long before Portland cement came along in the middle of the 19th century. They made a form of cement from what was known as pozzolano. It was ground up lava, and it was able to set underwater. That was one of the features of it. And there's huge structures in Italy made from this sort of Roman cement. But that's what it was being used as a coffee table when it was rediscovered recently. But the Navy, the diving branch of the Italian Navy were tasked with surveying the lake and surveying the wrecks. And the task was given to the man in charge of all the divers, Commendatore Vittorio Malfatti. That's him there. He had ceased diving himself, but he was in charge of all of the divers in the Italian Navy, and they surveyed the wreck very successfully and very accurately. This is some of the drawings that they did. You can see there, the one nearest to the shore was in, the bow was in 15 metres and the stern was in about 20 metres. That's to the deck area. And the other one was in about 30 metres down to 35 metres. As I say, they were designated as prima nave and secunda nave, first and second ship. Now they also delineated the outline of the wrecks. You can see there, that's the first ship there, and you can see the series of floating buoys that were put around the perimeter of the ship. Now, very little happened with the advent then of the First World War. Everything was put on hold, and nothing very much happened. But when Mussolini came to power with the Fascist Party in 1922, Mussolini took a great interest in the Roman wrecks of Lake Nemi, because he literally, it's a proven fact that he fancied himself as a reincarnation of the ancient Roman emperors, and that the Fascist Party were a reincarnation of the Roman Empire. And he proceeded to invade various countries to prove that out. The first place he invaded was Libya. So, as I say, nothing happened until well after the First War. In 1927 then, in 1925, it was decided by Mussolini and the fascist government that a great effort would be made to take the ships up out of the lake. As he was fascinated by anything whatever to do with ancient Rome. So, a great deal of money was made available, and Signor Commendatore Malfatti had advocated lowering the level of the lake. Instead of trying to bring the ships up to the surface of the lake, that the surface of the lake should be brought down to the level of the ships. And that's what they decided upon. Now, there was a great deal of work going on throughout Italy on the infrastructure, and there was a great deal of drainage of land going on. You can say what you like about the fascists. They were doing a huge amount of work on the infrastructure of the country. And as I said, there's a lot of drainage going on, being carried out by this firm here, Costruzioni Meccaniche Riva Milano. And these were some of the giant pumps that were used in these drainage projects. Now, it became a great cause célèbre among a great many people. A great big patriotic effort was put in. And a lot of people donated their time and equipment on a pro bono basis to the project. And this company in particular, they were getting huge government contracts at the time anyway. And the man in charge of the pumping division of that was the man who was put in overall charge of the project, a man called WWII. Tell you a bit more about him later on. He wrote a wonderful book about the whole project. But you can see the size of the pumps there, absolutely enormous. Now, as the level of the lake, they were pumping all together for about 5 years altogether. It started in 1927, and by 1930, they had uncovered the first of the ships down to the deck level. As the waters went down, they had to move the pumps out onto various barges and pontoons and so forth to continue pumping from there. That's some of the pumps there, and the great big pipelines going out. That's Guido Uccelli there, a great polymath man. He was an engineer, he was a historian. His attainments were far too many to mention, but he was the right man for the job at any rate. And I'll tell you a bit more about him later on. Now, they couldn't figure out initially, at the very initial stages, they couldn't figure out how they were going to get rid of the water out of the lake, and they considered siphoning the water out. And then they realised then that there was already, they considered also tunnelling through 1.5 kilometres of the mountain around the lake. But they realised that it had already been done during ancient Roman times. They were able to pump the water into this thing here called the emissario. That means the way out. And it was overgrown, and it went for 1.5 kilometres out through the mountain, and about there's a structure around the exit end of it at the far side of the hill, 1.5 kilometres out. And it had been built, tunnelled to keep the level of the water in the lake at a constant level during Roman times. And they found that it was totally adequate to take the amount of water that they were pumping out of the lake. Imagine what it must have been like tunnelling through solid rock like that. Some of the rock was very hard, some was quite soft, but you can still see the marks of the picks from the workers who dug the tunnel, more than likely dug by slaves with oil lamps for light. That's a shot down looking down through the emissario. Now I'll just show you a relatively modern day trip down into the emissario. Give you an idea what it was like.
On the 20th of October 1928, Mussolini, as head of state, officially inaugurated.
You can see him here coming in on a little boat over to switch on the pumps. And you can see him strutting along. He did a lot of strutting. I think he bears a remarkable resemblance to a certain American leader of the day, who seems to have adopted a great many of his mannerisms. But he was an extremely popular figure in the early days of the fascisti, of the fascist party, until he made the wrong decision to join with the Axis powers, join with Germany in the war against the Allies. And there's the pumps starting up in action there. You can see that absolutely enormous. Where are we now? Yeah, that's the first ship having been exposed. Now, when that was exposed, they didn't know whether they had the wherewithal to keep going and get down to the level of the second ship. Whether they didn't know whether the finance was forthcoming. Well, Mussolini stepped in and said, "No, this has to continue." So he made the money available, and the project carried on down to expose the second ship. That's the first one there when it had been exposed, and they were starting to take away the mud and get it stabilised, get a great big cradle underneath it. Now I mentioned some of those big side beams that held the platforms for the rowers. There's some of them still in place there. I'll tell you more about the hull, etc. I just a few minutes up, but there were literally thousands of artefacts down inside in the two vessels. Now, a great deal of them had been taken up beforehand, and well, there was literally just a jumble. As soon as the ship became exposed, a virtual army of people descended on it. Conservators, archaeologists, specialists in all sorts of things, and they got to work straight away, classifying and conserving all of the different artefacts that were there. These are terracotta pipes that were part of the central heating system that was aboard. It was a very elaborate system of plumbing aboard the ships with lead and copper pipes. And this was known in Roman times as a hypercaust. It was just, there were fires lit on slabs, on flagstones down below near the bilges. And the hot air from that was transmitted throughout the ship through these terracotta pipes. They're found frequently in old ancient Roman buildings, notably up in near Hadrian's Wall. A lot of buildings have been excavated up there, and there's a lot of these hyper-cost terracotta pipes have been found also. That's just another picture of the beams there. But some of the most beautiful artefacts that the latter day archaeologists discovered, and that Borgi before him had discovered, that had been taken off by the museum, were these square, hollow animal heads that adorned the ends of the beams that stuck out on the ships. Now, there are various animals, wolves particularly, lions, tigers and foxes. And as I say, the wolf has a great significance for Rome and for the Lake Nemi area. And a lot of these were replicated on various public buildings during the fascist period, and on furniture also. It was a bit of a symbol for the fascist party also, the wolf. Beautiful artifacts. That's a head of Medusa that went on, I think it went on one of the tillers. I'm not altogether sure where that would have been located on the ship. And these were hands that were on the front of the tillers. They were steered by rudder, and these hands were on the front of the tillers that they found. It's a feature on a lot of vessels, remains of vessels that are found throughout the Mediterranean, having a hand. It's a guiding hand, I think, or whatever. I don't know what the full significance of it is, but it's a very, very common motif. That's a picture one there. Beautiful artifact. Real work of art in its own right, isn't it? For a short while after the first vessel was uncovered, the public were allowed to troop around it and get a look at it. Before it was the public were stopped then from coming in. But this is a very rare coloured slide of the one of the ships there. I'll tell you a little bit in a minute now about the sheathing on the bottom of the ship there. And you can see the great big cradles that were made to take the ships up out of the lake. That's Signor Commendatore Malfatti. He had retired from the Navy, and he was given a job as a general factotum for greeting people and explaining about the various artifacts of the ships and so forth. But it's very interesting to look at the sheathing on the ships there. These ships were built in the very same manner as Roman warships and Roman cargo ships of the day, even though they were only floating on a lake. But they were massively built. The various timbers associated with the building of the ships was identified at the time, and there was timbers that had come from various parts of the empire. That was proven at the time. There was cedar from Lebanon and various pine tree wood from places like Cyprus. But they were sheathed with lead sheet over tarred felt, and the sheathing was held on with these flat-headed bronze nails. You can see them there. Now that on seagoing vessels, that was to stop marine growth, and it was also to stop these boring worms that you get like teredo and gribble also. Now you wouldn't have got that in fresh water, but nevertheless they proceeded to build them the very same as they would have been had they been going in the sea. Those are some of the nails that held on the lead sheathing. Now, the ships answered a lot of questions about the structure of Roman vessels. Now, there have been some various pieces of ships found and so forth on the various diving expeditions, but not a great many. They weren't built in the same manner as a carvel-built vessel today. The carvel-built vessel, you would stand up the frames and attach the planking or the strakes to the outside of it. These were built up, the planking was built up around molds, and the planking was put together with these tenons and loose mortises and loose tenons, a whole series of every few inches along the edges of the planks, and then they were pinned through with a wooden pin, and then they were of course caulked on the outside. But that was a standard way, and since a lot of discoveries have been made since, showing this sort of construction on ancient Roman vessels. That was one of the first artifacts they found, the stalk off the rudder, and they stuck out from the stern at an angle. I think there was 2 on each ship. That has one of those lion head decorations on the top of it. You can see the square hole that the tiller would have fitted into, one of the tillers. Now, they built a brand new museum up on top of the hill near the lake, and they built this slipway up to it, and they had to get the ships out of the lake on cradles. Now, they had great big 4-fold purchase blocks and tackle with great big electric engines, electric and diesel engines to pull the ships up. And that's a picture of one of them there on the slipway. This is an interesting, I think they may have been just pulling them by hand there just for the camera, because they did have a mechanical way of hauling them up. But you'll see them being dragged sideways by this gear that they use in this video clip. These are from the Pate newsreels. I don't think we're ever going to be able to see all of that somehow. It seems to be skipping off. We'll just see. Well, it's not coming up on this computer. It was coming up on the other one. Not to worry, but you can actually see them. They laid down great sheets of plywood and all sorts of blocks of timber, and they were able to slide the ship sideways to line them up with the trackway there before they hauled them out. Now these are. This is a picture of the museum. I visited there at one stage, and it was a great experience. My late sister Nori lived in Italy near Rome, and when we visited her, I drove up there on my own. Barbara wanted to go to St. Peter's, have a look and see could you see the Pope. But anyway, it was a great experience, as I said. But the museum was built of mass concrete. The Italians were very, very far ahead in the use of mass concrete structures back in the early 20th century. And the museum was built in that manner. Now the ships had to be kept damp when they were taken out. They had to be kept wet, because if they were allowed to dry out, they would have deteriorated and disintegrated probably. Now, they had nothing at all to go on for ships this size. Polyethylene glycol hadn't arrived in the world of conservation at this stage. There were other great big wooden vessels found, not quite as big as this of course, in Scandinavia in burial mounds, in places like Oseberg and Gokstad, great big Viking ships. And they were conserved and beautifully conserved and displayed. You can still see them today in museums in Scandinavia, in Norway. And they were conserved using linseed oil and alum. Now that wasn't going to work here. And as I said, polyethylene glycol. So the method that they decided upon was to use Stockholm tar or pine tar. That was in ubiquitous use all around Northern Europe on ships and on buildings. And it's a wonderful preservative. It's got by boiling pine roots. Beautiful smell off it too. I've used it myself several times. But it's my son lives in Switzerland in a 300-year-old house that's been given successive coats of this pine tar over the century, over the years, and it's in immaculate condition. It's absolutely completely intact, great condition altogether. They worked on them first in this temporary hangar that was given to them by the Italian Air Force, the Aeronautica. They did a lot of work while they were undercover in the temporary hangars, and they were taken out first. You can see there all the blocks of wooden sheets of stuff that was used. The mud had to be dug out from around them as they put up the cradles and barrowed off the site in wheelbarrows. You can see there the giant cradles that they had to make. Now, two of the things that they found laid to rest an argument that had gone on for a great deal of time about how Roman anchors were configured. There was a great many of these. They had great big lead stocks on them. You see it there, and a great many of those have been found in the Mediterranean, mostly by sponge divers. And a great argument has ensued as to how they actually worked. But they were on wooden anchors, and the wooden anchors had another lead configuration around the bottom end there. You can't see it on that. And they also had earthen tips there on the flukes. And when this anchor was found, it still had the great big rope cable attached to it. That's it there. You can just see the cable here in the corner of the slide. It was taken up and copies were made of it. That's a present day copy of the anchor there. But I'll just go back there for a second to show you. Now, the anchor up above is practically the same as what we call an Admiralty anchor today. And the British Navy claimed ownership of the design of that, or claimed responsibility for having designed that type of anchor. It has all the same elements as an Admiralty anchor. But as you can see there, it was invented a long, long time before that. It even has a link on the bottom for a tripping line.
Oh, yeah.
That was sheathed in wood also, I might add. This small boat was found in the lake near one of the wrecks. It had been filled with stones and sunk. Now, it's not known how the ships actually sank. They may well have just become waterlogged and sank, or they may have been sunk deliberately by the Emperor Caligula to efface some of the memory of his decadent predecessor as he would have seen him. But it's not known. There was no evidence of when the ships were taken out of how they had been sunk. But this one was filled with stones when it was found. I'll show you some of the stuff that was found on the ships there. There was lots of these bronze guardrails. Beautiful, actually. There was quite a good few of these around the gunnels of the ships. And they have a very unique sort of motif on them. A lot of them have these two-headed figures. Now, the ancient Roman god Janus was a figure with two faces, one front and one back. It was a god of beginnings and endings.
Sorry.
And these are a bit unusual now. They may have been just Emperor Caligula's take on the god Janus, because the face on one side is of a female, and on the other side it's of a small. That's just a head of the god Pan, half goat, half man. But these are some of the motifs, the little statuettes off the guardrail. And this is a dwarf-like figure. Now, there's quite a lot of these found, and a woman's face on one side and the dwarf's face on the other side. Now, it's known that the Emperor Caligula actually instigated gladiatorial contests in the arena between dwarf gladiators and women gladiators. So it may have some reference to that. It's not known, but it is a fact that he did that. So he may be just a take on that. But there's no other instance of this particular type of statuette anywhere else in the Roman world that's been found. Unique to Lake Nemi. That's one of them there. A great many ordinary everyday artefacts were found, in common with the other vessels that I showed you, the Mary Rose and the Vasa. Earthenware and silver pots, metal vessels of various sorts, pans and skillets, so forth. Great many great big bronze fixings were found also, and clenchings of all sorts like that. This was a very common type of method of fixing two pieces of timber together on the ship. It's called clenching. It literally means just bending the spike over and then bending it again and burying that end in the plank or timber or whatever it was. It's just like a clenched fist, if you can imagine. It gave rise to the term clinker building. It used to be called clencher building one time. A lot of that was found. Some pieces of joinery were found, which almost could have been come from the Georgian period, with similar types of handles and hinges. Replicas have been made of those also. As I said, there was a very elaborate system of plumbing aboard. And this is a great big bronze stopcock, very modern looking, great big soldered joint, I think, on it there. And quite a lot of smaller versions of this. So there seems to have been quite an elaborate arrangement of plumbing on board for various purposes. That's a bronze helmet with a griffin motif on the top. Now there was buildings on both of these ships. Now they weren't wooden buildings, they were actual buildings built of marble and masonry. And a lot of them had marble columns and tile roofs and so forth. And quite a lot of those were found down in the mud. Some of them had toppled off the ship, some of them were found in the ships. That's the base off one of them there. That's a beautiful spiral reeded column, I suppose, with a Corinthian capital on it. Beautiful piece of work. And that's some of them there in the museum today. I think it looks like a rather pinky coloured marble. Great many grappling hooks were found that had been used over the centuries in trying to get the ships up. And a lot of those had remained on the vessels. A lot of pieces of terracotta and a lot of pieces of
Glazed.
what's the word I'm looking for now?
Glazed.
No, it's glazed earthenware anyway.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have the colours of the present day Italian flag on them. Now, I don't know whether there's any connection there, whether that was an old traditional motif that they adopted as the flag of Italy or not, but quite a lot of that material. These are copper roof tiles. Now, there were copper roof tiles on some of the buildings that had been there, and also some earthenware ones. Throughout the whole of the period when the ships were in the museum, Mussolini was a frequent visitor, and he was a very, very popular visitor with all the workers that were there. He regularly called in to see how progress was going. It was more or less like his pet project. You can see him there being applauded by the workers. As I say, he was very, very popular in the early days of his regime, before he threw in his lot with Hitler. That's a picture of one of the tillers with the blade of the rudder is just marked out in a piece of metal to show you what it would have been like. Very elaborate arrangement of tillers and rudders and so forth. That's a replica one of them that's there today. That's a picture of one of the ships in the museum. Now, it became an extremely popular venue. Millions of people visited the museum between 1937 when it opened. Sorry, I beg your pardon. No, I think it was 1934 it opened. And 1939, and then the Second World War came along. Now, during the Second World War, as I say, Mussolini had thrown in his lot with the Germans, with Hitler. And the Allies, in 1944, the Allies had invaded first Sicily and then came ashore at Anzio and a couple of other places. And they were having a torrid time moving northwards up along Italy. They faced very determined opposition from the German army, not so much from the Italian army. A lot of the Italian army surrendered. And at one stage in 1944, Italy capitulated and went over to the side of the Allies. Mussolini was deposed and he was put under house arrest in a hotel up on a mountain in northern Italy. I can't remember the name of the mountain now. But Hitler sent in a squad of crack commandos to rescue Mussolini. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. But the Germans had established a defensive line right across Rome, right across Italy, from just south of Rome, from the Alban Hills right across over to the Adriatic coast. And as I said, the Allies were having a very torrid time dislodging them. You may have seen the bombing of Monte Cassino. That was part of that campaign to try and dislodge the Germans. Now, there was an SS anti-aircraft unit stationed near the museum. We're coming to the tragic part now. They came under fire from an American artillery unit. And shortly after they came under fire, they folded their tent and left. Now, they had ordered the staff out of the museum at gunpoint, and shortly after they drove away, and the staff were still near hand, smoke was seen issuing from the museum. And everything inside the museum that was capable of being burned was burned to ashes. 2 ships were burned, completely burned to ashes, and nothing remained of them at all. There was even great heaps of lead from the lead sheathing on the floor of the museum. Now, the museum survived having been built of mass concrete and was later refurbished. But some of the artefacts that were metal survived, some were offside, being conserved still, because there was thousands of artefacts, but nothing at all remained of the ships. It was generally reckoned that the SS threw incendiary grenades into the museum, and it wasn't. They later denied it, but it wasn't the first piece of such vandalism that they did. They burned libraries and museums all the way up along Italy and left scorched earth in their track. Dreadful piece of vandalism. Shocking. The man who rescued Mussolini off the mountaintop hotel where he was under guard was a German commander called Otto Skorzeny. He lived in Ireland afterwards for some time. Mussolini was set up down in northern Italy, right up in the north of Italy, as a puppet to try and re-establish fascist reign again. But at this stage the Allies were moving very rapidly up Italy, and they were defeating everything in front of them. They had massive air power at their disposal also. Mussolini and his girlfriend, we call her, his partner, were captured by some partisans and they were executed. And Mussolini had tried to escape by dressing up as a common soldier, just in a private's uniform, but he was recognised by the partisans and Italian partisans, and he was shot. And their bodies were desecrated and hung up in public like this, along with some more collaborators, you might call them. So Mussolini, the man who fancied himself as a latter-day Roman emperor, he died a very violent death at the hands of his fellow countrymen, just the same as his emperor predecessor Caligula had. The museum was refurbished and it's back in action. There's a 1/8 model of one of the ships in one part of the museum that was built in the dockyard in Genoa by the shipwrights there. And there are various parts of the ship that have been replicated, like this bit here, just to give you an idea. Several bits like that, modern replications, just to let you know how the ship was constructed. And there are quite a lot of other artefacts that found their way into the museum from various other places. A lot of the material that was taken up by the early divers with the platform and so forth, timber was brought up, and a lot of that was made into walking sticks and souvenir boxes and stuff like that. And it was a time of what were known as antiquarians. They hadn't got the same sort of reverence for antiquities back then, except as personal possessions. So a lot of that sort of stuff came back to the museum ultimately. And it's really well worth a visit today, despite the fact that the ships are no longer there. As I say, it has sort of a hollow ring to it, and that's one of the portions there that's been replicated of the ship. Guido Uccelli was, as I said, a great polymath and engineer, and he was a director of that firm that did the pumping. He was one of the owners of the firm. He wrote a wonderful book called Nemi. Now, I managed to get my hands on a copy of it. Extremely rare book, and it's written in Italian. It's never been translated into English. Now, I managed to read it after a fashion from cover to cover using an Italian translator, digital translator, and an Italian dictionary. And Mario from the local chip shop was wonderful with all the help that he gave me. But I had the poor man driven mad ringing him up, asking him what does this mean. But I have to say he took a huge interest in it, and he entered into it wholeheartedly. I was glad to help. But it's a wonderful book. Uccelli, he was bitterly opposed throughout his whole life to the fascists, despite all of the work that was being given to his firm. He was opposed to their principle, and he was captured by, he was taken prisoner by the Italian government because he was helping Jews escape from Italy. And he was badly beaten while in prison. And he managed to get out of prison in 1944 in a prisoner exchange with the Germans. And he joined the partisans and spent the rest of the war fighting with the partisans. And he lived up to 1964. This was the artefact that disappeared during the time the goods were being transferred from the National Museum into the Lake Nemi Museum. And it was actually purloined by a policeman, purloined it and sold it on to some Italian noble family who sold it on again to an antique dealer in New York. And somebody just overheard, there was a documentary going on somewhere in America, and the antique dealer and his wife were there, and the wife said to the antique, "Oh, look at that, there's our table." And somebody overheard them and reported it to the authorities, and he was investigated, and they found that he had, because there was a wanted ad up for this, on the internet. It was known that it had been there and had disappeared. The Arts and Antiquities Fraud Division were after it. So it was given back, and it's now back in the museum. I don't think they had very much choice, but they'll give it back anyway. That's quite a big piece, as you can see. It would have made a very fine table. This is the last slide you'll be glad to hear. The lake wasn't drained out entirely. They only brought it down to the level of the bottom of the second ship, and a great deal of water remained for a couple of metres in the bottom of the lake. And that area was never really fully explored, and they've been exploring it in recent times. And this was a find that they made, a great big marble head, probably of the goddess Diana. And that's now being conserved and will go into the museum. So we leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.